The assignment came through on a Tuesday, which is how most things in my life have arrived, not dramatically, not with warning, just a message in the queue between a supply manifest and a shift rotation confirmation. Ward Officer Kale S. assigned. Vel'kaar Treaty Passage, Barge Aranith's Meridian, 9-day crossing of the Sari Vale Intersystem Transit Strait, standard diplomatic escort duty, depart Orcs Station in 6 days. I read it twice, noted the departure window, and went back to my coffee. I had done 11 crossings in the prior 3 years. They were not exciting. That was, in fact, the point. I should explain what a treaty ward officer is, since the title is not widely known, and most people who hear it picture something more dramatic than it deserves. When the Union entered transit compact arrangements with species whose internal diplomatic protocols required a biological presence, not a recorded proxy, not a filed notification, not a data stamp, but a warm body with a Union compact seal on its wrist, the Treaty Ward Officer Program was created to provide exactly that. We were not soldiers officially. We were not diplomats officially. We were, in the language of the compact, a present human guarantor of continuity of passage, which meant we sat on whatever vessel the passage required, attended whatever functions demanded human presence, did not initiate contact, did not interfere with the host vessel's protocols, and ensured that the record showed a human had been physically aboard for the duration. We were, in the polite estimation of most alien courts we encountered, furniture with credentials. I had no argument with that assessment. I am 51 years old. I retired from Union Frontier Infantry after 23 years with 3 citations I don't talk about, a left knee that predicts weather, and a considered preference for quiet. Ward officer work was, for me, a near-perfect occupation. Long periods of structured inaction punctuated by the occasional piece of administrative paperwork. I carried a compact seal, a sidearm I had not discharged in 3 years, and a small personal library in my reader. The crossings were long. I read a great deal. There is a version of this story that begins with something dramatic and builds to a moment of obvious significance. I do not have that story. What I have is the version where a man packed a duffel, took a transit pod to a dock, boarded a ceremonial barge, read a book for 6 days, and then spent 38 minutes being very quiet in a corridor. The significance, such as it was, came afterward and was not something I arranged. The Aranith's Meridian was moored at Orcs Station's lower transit dock when I arrived. She was a Vel'kaar ceremonial passage barge, which means she was beautiful in a way I had no adequate category for. The hull was dark blue-black, almost organic in its curve, with gold inlay along the waterline that I later learned was an unbroken navigational hymn in old Vel'kaar characters, 3,000 words long, that had been rendered on every vessel of this class for 400 years. She was not large by intersystem standards, but she was built as a statement. This is the way things have always been done, and we are not apologizing for it. I stood on the dock for a moment before boarding and looked at her, and I thought that, whatever the crossing was going to be, it was going to be pleasant to look at the hull. I checked in with the vessel's transit coordinator, a Vel'kaar administrative officer named Vareth Ansari, who had the amber gold coloring of the Vel'kaar upper registry tier, and the expression of a person who found human ward officers a manageable inconvenience. He showed me my berth, a narrow but clean compartment on the lower port deck, confirmed my compact seal registration, gave me a printed schedule of the 9 days, and told me with brisk courtesy that my presence would be required at the formal departure observance on day 1, the mid-passage ceremony on day 5, and the arrival reception on day 9. On all other days, I was free to maintain my quarters or use the lower observation deck. I thanked him. He left. I unpacked my duffel, stowed my reader, and spent 4 hours reading before the departure observance required me to find a clean jacket. The first time I saw Vel'kaar Ansari, she was standing at the forward rail of the upper deck during the departure observance, watching Orath Station fall away behind us. She was taller than I had expected. Most Vel'sari of the upper registry were, with the amber gold skin of her tear and hair that was black braided through with silver wire in the ceremonial fashion, coiled at the back of her head in a structure that I could tell had taken considerable time. Her eyes were compound, the gold of them catching the station's departure lights and holding them. She was wearing the dark ceremonial robe of a treaty-bound passage, which meant she was the one, the third-tier bonding candidate in the treaty I was here to witness. I had read the compact documentation, as was required. I knew the shape of it. The Vel'sari-Ansari lineage had entered a treaty bonding arrangement with the Union Compact framework under Article 23 of the Bilateral Passage Accords, which created a formal relational compact between a registered Vel'sari royal and a Union Treaty Ward officer for the duration of any contested transit crossing. It was a piece of procedural architecture that dated from the initial contact period, when the Vel'kaar Dominion had made several attempts to interfere with Vel'sari transit lanes under the argument that unescorted Vel'sari vessels were eligible for inspection under Dominion Reach law. The treaty bonding was the legal counter. A formally registered bonded pair aboard a vessel complicated the Reach laws, standing in ways that the Vel'kaar legal apparatus had never found a clean way around. The bond was on paper. It had no other requirement. I was, as I said, furniture with credentials, expensive and legitimate furniture. She noticed me during the observance in the way one notices a piece of furniture that has been arranged differently than expected. I was standing at the permitted ward officer position on the lower deck, to the left of the main observance gathering, in my clean jacket with my compact seal showing. She looked at me once from the upper deck for approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked back at the station. It was not an impolite look. It was a look of accurate assessment. She had noted what I was, middle-aged, unremarkable, present. She had filed this information. She had returned to things of interest. I did not take offense at this. In my experience, accurate assessment is undervalued. She had looked at the available information and reached a defensible conclusion. The available information at that point was one middle-aged human male in a clean jacket, standing in a procedurally designated spot, with no visible claim on anyone's attention. If I had been in her position and looking at me, I would have reached the same conclusion. The difference between me and that conclusion was not visible from the upper deck during a departure observance. It was not visible at all, most of the time. It was available if the situation asked for it. The court's response to me over the following 3 days was more variously expressed, but arrived at the same destination. Vel'kaar Ansari, the transit coordinator, was efficient and correct. Her senior attendant, a woman named Thessal Anveth who managed the princess's daily schedule, acknowledged my presence when protocol required and did not manufacture reasons to interact otherwise. The 2 younger attendants, Sarivale and Arath Ansari, conducted conversations within my earshot on 2 separate occasions in which my position on the barge was described with, I thought, a reasonable degree of accuracy. A union form, a treaty requirement, a presence guarantee. One of them used the phrase, the quiet one. This was also accurate. I did not have objections to being described accurately. I ate my meals in the lower dining section, which was not segregated, but was demonstrably less frequented by the court. I spent my mornings on the lower observation deck with my reader. I completed the mid-morning compact log, which required me to note the date, our transit position, and the fact of my continued physical presence aboard, a document I had filled out approximately 3,000 times across my career, always noting that I was, in fact, still there. I did my stretches. I drank too much of the Vel'sari grain tea, which was excellent, and I read. I notice things as I always do. It is not a talent, exactly. 23 years of frontier infantry either teaches you to notice things or it teaches you to stop noticing things because you didn't survive long enough to keep the habit. I survived, so I notice. I noticed the structure of the Araneth's meridian, her corridors, her access points, her observation deck sightlines, her crew rotation schedule. Not systematically, not with any particular purpose. Just the way you notice the geography of any space you inhabit for a significant period of time. You come to know it the way you know a room you sleep in, not by deciding to learn it, but by being there and paying attention. I noticed the crew, the 18 Vel'kaar vessel staff who maintained the barge and ran her systems. They were professional and largely invisible in the way good vessel crews are, and the 2 or 3 of them I encountered with any regularity were courteous in the distant, correct manner of people who are not sure what category I occupied. I noticed the cargo manifest, which I had a right to review as ward officer and did on day 2, mostly ceremonial goods and personal effects, correctly documented. I noticed the transit lane we were crossing, the Scifi Strait, 7 days of open intersystem space between the Vel'kaar orbital territories and their destination registry, with 2 authorized inspection points and 1 contested sovereignty zone in the final quarter of the crossing. That last item was why I was on the barge. On day 4, Thesavel Ansari came to the lower observation deck. I was reading. I heard her footsteps. The Vel'kaar upper registry wore formal footwear that had a particular sound on the metal observation deck, a deliberate, even cadence, and I looked up. She was alone, which surprised me. She stood for a moment at the forward end of the deck, looking out at the transit lane, the star field ahead soft and deep in the observation glass. Then she walked to the far end of the deck and stood there. I returned to my reader. After a few minutes, she said, in compact standard, which was correct but formal in the way a language sounds when it has been learned by instruction rather than immersion. You have been on this deck every morning. Yes, I said. There was a pause. I kept reading. She said, you do not seem bored. I'm not, I said. Another pause. I turned a page. She said, most ward officers I have seen on passage crossings spend their time in their berth or attempting to attend court functions. The court functions don't require me until day 5, I said. The berth is comfortable but the light is poor. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what are you reading? I told her. It was a survey of early Union diplomatic contact protocols, which I read occasionally not because it was exciting, but because understanding the original reasoning behind the compact documents I was living inside seemed useful, and also because it occasionally had good stories about people making very strange decisions under pressure. She listened to this explanation and said nothing. I returned to my page. After a few more minutes, she went back inside. She returned the following morning and stood at the far end of the deck again. We did not speak. On the 6th morning, she brought 2 cups of grain tea, set one on the railing nearest me without comment, and stood at the forward end of the deck with the other. I drank my tea. She looked out at the stars. After a while, I went back to reading. It was, I thought, a reasonable arrangement. I want to be accurate about how things were between us during those quiet days. There was no warmth exactly. There was the beginning of something careful, a territorial acknowledgement maybe, 2 organisms who had established that they occupied the same space with different purposes and were provisionally all right with that. She didn't ask me more questions after that first day. I didn't offer conversation, but she kept coming to the deck. And I noticed, in the way I notice things, that she was watching me, not with any particular expression. Just with the attention of someone conducting a reassessment they had not planned to make, driven by whatever small observations had accumulated that she had not expected to accumulate. I did not find this uncomfortable. I have been watched by experts, by people who were trying to find something wrong with me, or something useful about me, or something frightening about me, or something to dismiss. Her watching was not any of those. It was something quieter and more honest, the look of a person reconsidering a file they thought was complete. What she would have seen on those mornings if she was looking. A middle-aged man with dark hair gone fully silver, reading without apparent urgency, drinking tea, occasionally stretching a leg that bothered him, wearing the same clean jacket, not performing anything, not attempting to be noticed, not attempting to be invisible, simply present. I have been told by a few people who have known me across several years that my variety of presence can be disconcerting if you expect a person to announce what they are. I don't announce. I am there, and I know what I know, and if the day requires it, I use what I know, and if the day does not require it, I read my book. She was watching for something and finding it slowly. Not a revelation, not a dramatic unveiling, but the accumulation of evidence that what she had looked at and categorized on day one was not, in fact, the complete file. The mid-passage ceremony on day 5 was a brief and formal thing, a compact observance in the barge's central ceremonial hall, attended by the full court and the senior crew. I stood in the ward officer's position, to the side, as was correct. I spoke the 3 lines of compact standard that the ceremony required. She stood at the forward position and spoke the Vel'kaar portion of the ceremony in a voice that was clear and practiced and gave nothing away. Afterward, in the corridor, she passed close enough to my position that I could have spoken to her. I did not. She did not. We returned separately to our respective parts of the barge, but I noticed in the corridor, for a moment, that she looked at me with a quality of attention that was different from the first days. She had been building something in her assessment, and the ceremony had given her another piece. On the morning of day 7, the Vel'kaar came. I felt them before the alert sounded, not through any mystical sense, just through the particular quality of the crew's movement. The Vel'kaar crew of the Aranith's Meridian were, in my observation, a composed and professional group. When I came up to the lower observation deck at my usual time and found 2 of the crew moving at a different pace than they had for 6 days, I put my reader in my jacket pocket and stood up. The transit alert sounded approximately 90 seconds later. The Vel'kaar Dominion had, per the compact documentation I had read at the outset of the crossing, a contested right of inspection in the final quarter of the Scifi Strait. This was legally murky and the subject of an ongoing bilateral dispute at the compact tribunal level. The Vel'kaar position was that the right of inspection did not apply to formally bonded treaty passage vessels, which we were, on paper, and the Vel'kaar position was that the bonding only counted if a genuine biological bond registration had been completed at a Union Compact station, which required physical proximity documentation over a minimum of 14 days, which we had not yet completed. The Vel'kaar legal team was clever about this particular gap. They had exploited it before. I had read about 3 prior instances in the supplementary documentation attached to the crossing assignment. Vareth Ansari found me on the lower deck within 4 minutes of the alert. His expression was controlled, but I could read, in the set of his shoulders and the particular speed at which he was walking, that he was not comfortable with what was coming. He said, "The Vel'kaar inspection vessel Reach Command Davar has requested compliance boarding. We are within the contested inspection zone. The Princess's legal counsel is preparing documentation." I said, "How many boarders?" He said, "The standard inspection team, 6 officers, 2 senior Reach blades." I looked at him. He understood what I was saying without my saying it. A standard inspection team did not bring 2 Reach blades. The Reach blades were the Vel'kaar's enforcement tier. They were large. The Vel'kaar were uniformly large, scaled in the rust red and copper brown of their northern registry, built along the lines of something designed to make other things reconsider their choices. Reach blades were the senior operational tier. They came when the Vel'kaar expected to need them. I asked, "Where will they board?" "Lower starboard access. The ward officer position during a Vel'kaar boarding is typically." "I know what it is," I said. "I'll be there." The treaty ward officer's position during a contested boarding was technically adjacent to the transit coordinator, non-participating. It had been designed for exactly the situation we were in, a human presence to complicate the Vel'kaar legal standing, close enough to be on record, uninvolved enough not to create an incident. I had done this twice before on earlier crossings, and both times it had resolved without drama. The Vel'kaar inspection team noting the ward officer's presence, completing a brief formal inspection, and departing. The legal math didn't favor them once a human was on the manifest. This time, the math was apparently different. I was at the lower starboard access before the boarding hatch opened. Vareth was beside me. Two of the vessel's crew were positioned further back, which was correct. They were not to engage with the boarding team. I was the legal anchor. I stood in the position I knew was right, just behind the access point, visible, compact seal evident on my wrist, jacket on, hands at my sides. I should describe what I was doing internally, because the external picture was one of a man standing still in a corridor, and standing still in a corridor does not adequately convey what it is. 23 years of frontier infantry had taught me a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of someone frozen or afraid, but the stillness of someone who has gathered their attention into a single organized point and is holding it there, quietly, waiting for the moment when it will be needed. I had this stillness in me the way you have a thing that was forged a long time ago. It was not something I performed. It was simply what I was. The Vel'kaar boarding team came through the hatch in the order you would expect. 6 inspection officers first, copper-scaled in the rustan brown of their standard uniform, equipment belts, no visible weapons drawn. Then the 2 reach blades. The reach blades were taller than I was by roughly 30 centimeters and wider by a significant margin. They had the heavier scale plate of the senior Vel'kaar cast along their shoulders and forearms, and their eyes, amber, horizontal pupil, not unlike the Velsari gold but colder in register, took in the corridor, the 2 crew members, Vareth, and then me. The senior reachblade said something in Vel'kaar that the translation unit on my wrist rendered as, "The small one is the human." The second reachblade said, "The bond guarantor." The first one said something the translation unit struggled with, which came through as, "It is a passage formality. The compact language has not been satisfied. We are within our authority." I didn't say anything. They were looking at me, and this was, I should explain, a thing I had encountered in varying forms throughout my career. The Vel'kaar were not small. They were the reach blades in particular, built along lines that their own evolutionary history had selected for, which is to say they were very large, heavily plated, and accustomed to being the largest and most heavily plated thing in any given space. They had a way of looking at things they had determined were not a threat. I had seen it before, in different species, in different contexts. It was a kind of visual dismissal. The eyes moved over you and mentally reclassified you as part of the background geometry. The senior reach blade did this to me efficiently and without malice. I was the small one. I was the formality. I was the ward officer standing in the corridor like a piece of equipment that had been left there by someone with administrative responsibilities. I stood and looked back at them. The boarding team moved. The 6 inspection officers spread into the lower corridor, 2 toward cargo, 2 toward the lower crew deck, 2 staying with the reach blades. Vareth began providing the formal transit documentation. This was the procedure. I was an observer. The senior reachblade said, "In compact standard this time. The inspection will require access to the royal quarter deck." Vareth said, "The royal quarters are exempt from Vel'kaar reach of inspection under Article 7 of the Bilateral Transit Compact." The reachblade said, "Article 7 applies to vessels with completed bond registration. Your documentation is." I said, "The documentation is current." They both looked at me. I had not planned to speak at that precise moment. But there is a point, in my experience, where silence becomes a different kind of statement than the one you're trying to make, and I had reached it. I said, "In the compact standard I had spoken in one form or another for 30 years. The treaty bond documentation was registered at Orcs Station on the day of departure. The 14-day proximity requirement applies to residential bond registrations, not treaty passage bond registrations. You are citing the wrong section of the compact. The senior reachblade looked at me with the expression of someone recalculating the weight of a piece of furniture that has turned out to be heavier than expected. He said, "The distinction between residential and passage bond registration is currently in dispute before the Compact Tribunal." "It is," I said. "The preliminary finding issued 17 months ago establishes that passage bond registration carries equivalent legal standing until the tribunal reaches final judgment. The preliminary finding is binding. You have access to it through your own legal archive. It was filed under Compact Docket Reference Vel'kaar 9 through 11. There was a pause. The second reachblade said something quietly in Vel'kaar. The translation unit rendered it as, "He knows the documents." I had not, I should be clear, prepared this exchange. I had read the compact documentation the way I read everything, thoroughly and without any specific plan to use it. The docket reference was in my memory the way most things that I read are in my memory, filed without effort and available when relevant. I had not anticipated needing it today, but I had it. The senior reachblade said, "Your documentation may satisfy the legal threshold. We are still entitled to conduct a formal inventory of the lower decks." "Yes," I said, "you are. The inventory is permitted. The royal quarters are not included in the inventory scope under any interpretation of the current disputed language. If you proceed to the royal quarters, the compact seal on my wrist timestamps a formal protest, and the docket filing goes to the tribunal within the hour. That changes the preliminary findings. Wait at the next session." He looked at me. I looked at him. The corridor was quiet except for the sound of the inspection officers moving through the cargo section further aft. I want to be honest about what I was doing in that corridor. I was not performing. I was not making a speech. I was stating facts that I knew to be true in a tone that had cost me a certain amount of time and difficulty to acquire over the preceding decades, which was the tone of a man who has been in worse rooms than this one and found them survivable. I was not afraid exactly. I was very alert. There is a distinction, and it matters. The reachblades were large, and they had authority, and they had the institutional weight of the Vel'kaar Dominion behind them. But I had the compact documents, and I had the preliminary docket finding, and I had been standing in rooms like this one, smaller, larger, differently shaped, differently occupied, for most of my adult life. There is a thing that happens, in my experience, when a very large entity, human, alien, institutional, encounters something smaller than expected that does not behave the way size differential predicts. There is a moment of recalculation. I have seen it in officers on the frontier who expected new infantry to break. I have seen it in reachblades in a corridor on a ceremonial barge 7 days out from Orcs station. The recalculation happens in the pause. The eyes do something slightly different. And then the very large entity makes a choice about what to do with the information. The senior reachblade said, "We will conduct the inventory of the lower decks." "I'll accompany you," I said. He said, "That is not necessary." "It is required," I said. "Under the ward officer provision, I have the right of accompaniment during any inspection that touches treaty-relevant spaces. This is a treaty-relevant space." Another pause. The second reachblade said, in compact standard, "The ward officer provision." And there was something in his voice, not admiration, not quite, something more like the sound of a recalculation completing, the way a number sounds different when you say it after you've understood what it means. They conducted their inventory of the lower decks. I walked with them. I did not speak further unless asked a direct question, which happened twice, once about a cargo container's manifest entry, which I could answer because I had reviewed the manifest on day 2, and once about the compact seal's timestamp capability, which I could answer because I had been using the compact seal for 15 years. Both answers were correct. Neither made the Vel'kaar inspection team visibly pleased. They had come expecting a formality. They were finding something more precisely calibrated than a formality, and the precision was not, in the end, on their side. The inventory took 38 minutes, then they left. I stood at the lower starboard access and watched the boarding hatch close and felt, as I sometimes feel after long, careful things, the specific quietness that comes when something that required attention has been given sufficient attention and concluded. My heart rate had been elevated throughout. I am 51, not dead, but it had stayed at the level where it is useful, where it sharpens rather than narrows. There is a line between those two things. I crossed it once, early in my infantry service, and the experience of crossing it taught me where the line was and how to stand on the right side of it. I noticed my heart rate returning to normal. I stretched my left knee, which ached the way it sometimes does when I stand in one position for a long time without movement. Vel'kaar Ansari was still beside me. He said after a moment, "You know the compact documentation." "It's my job," I said. He was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, "They expected to go to the royal quarters." "I know," I said. He said, "The princess's legal counsel has been working on the documentation question for 6 months and has not found the docket reference you cited." I didn't say anything to that. It wasn't a comment that required a response exactly. It was more the kind of statement that a person makes when they are revising something they believe to be true and haven't quite finished the revision yet. I understood it. I let it sit. I went back to the lower observation deck. I did not, in fact, return to my reader. I stood at the rail and looked at the transit lane, and I thought about the Vel'kaar and the barge and the 9 days, and the legal gap that their team had been exploiting for long enough to have a practiced routine around it. I thought about the preliminary docket, finding that Vel'kaar Ansari's legal counsel had apparently not located. I thought about the way the second Reachblade had said, "the ward officer provision," with that particular quality in his voice. The way a word sounds when it has just been assigned a new weight. I have been, for most of my life, a quiet and unremarkable person in the estimation of the various courts and councils and institutional bodies that my work has brought me into proximity with. This is not a complaint. It is, in many ways, what I wanted. I served in the infantry for 23 years because the infantry understood what I was and used me accordingly. I transitioned to ward officer work because it suited the person I had become, which was someone who had learned, at considerable personal cost, to do exactly what was needed and no more, and to carry the knowledge of what was needed in the place where it could be accessed when required. I was not a spectacular instrument. I was a reliable one. There is, in my experience, a meaningful difference. The spectacular instruments get used in the moments of peak brightness, and then they rest. The reliable ones are where they are needed before anyone asks. I stayed on the deck until the dinner hour, then I went in. She was in the lower dining section when I arrived. This was unusual. In 6 days she had not eaten in the lower section. She was sitting with Vel'kaar Ansari and her senior attendant, Thessal Anveth, at the main table rather than the upper partition, which the court typically used. She looked up when I came in. I took my usual seat at the smaller table near the viewing port and served myself from the communal dishes without making anything of it. She watched me the way she had watched me on the observation deck, with the particular attention of someone conducting an assessment they had not expected to need to conduct. I ate my dinner. At some point during the second course, she said, across the room, "The Vel'kaar have attempted this boarding 3 times in the past 4 years. Each time they have reached the royal quarters." I said, "The docket reference wasn't well publicized. The tribunal filed the preliminary finding in a procedural subindex that doesn't appear in most standard legal searches." She said, "You found it." "I read the compact documentation when I received the assignment," I said. "I noticed it was there." There was a pause. She said, "You were in the infantry." For 23 years, I said. She was quiet, then she said, the Reachblades called you the small one. I heard, I said. They stopped calling you that, she said, after the corridor. I thought about this. I said, they recalibrated. She looked at me for a moment with those compound gold eyes, and I could see, in the way you can sometimes see a thing without being able to name it exactly, that she was doing something she had not been doing at the beginning of the crossing. She was looking at me instead of at what she had expected to see when she looked in my direction. There is a difference between those two things. I recognized the difference because I have seen it before, usually from the other side, usually much later in a process and under less comfortable circumstances. To see it now, in a dining room, over grain dishes, on a ceremonial barge crossing a quiet transit lane, this was a different kind of occasion. I finished my dinner. I said good evening to the room and went back to my berth. I read for an hour and fell asleep. On day 8 I was on the observation deck in the morning. She came again with 2 cups of grain tea. She set mine on the railing and stood at the forward end of the deck. For a while neither of us spoke. Then she said, "What did the second Reachblade say to the first one, in the corridor, when they looked at each other?" I told her what the translation unit had rendered. "He knows the documents." She was quiet. I said it wasn't a compliment, it was a recalculation. "I know," she said. "I have heard Vel'kaar make that sound before, when they are deciding whether they have misread something." She paused. "They concluded they had misread you." I didn't answer. She looked out at the stars. The transit lane ahead of us was bright and deep, and the destination registry was, per the morning log, approximately 31 hours out. After a while she said, "My legal counsel spent 6 months working on the boarding prevention documentation. She is the best compact scholar on the Vel'kaar registry. She is also," she added, with a precision that I recognized as entirely deliberate, "considerably younger than you." I said, "The subindex where the preliminary finding was filed was changed in a routine compact archive reorganization 11 years ago. Before the reorganization, it would have been in the standard search path. After, it wasn't. If your counsel's research started in the last decade, she would never have encountered it." She said, "How did you find it?" I said, "I've been reading compact documentation for 15 years. I've seen the archive go through 4 reorganizations. When I read the current documentation, I noticed the citation chain from the original disputed language had a gap, which usually means something was moved and not properly cross-referenced. So I looked in the old indexing format." I paused. It took about an hour. She was very still. She said, "You found it in an hour." "Once I knew where to look," I said. She turned and looked at me directly, the way she had not done since that first evening of the departure observance when she had looked at me for 3 seconds and classified me as furniture. She looked at me for considerably longer this time. I let her look. I drank my grain tea and looked out at the transit lane. There was nothing defensive in being looked at. She was a person revising a file. It was reasonable to look at the file. She said finally, "I have been told by the people who manage these crossings that ward officers are a legal formality." "We often are," I said. "You are not," she said. I thought about this for a moment. I said, "I was what the assignment required. Yesterday it required more than a formality." I looked at her. "That's not unusual in my experience. Things require what they require." She looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded once, in the Vel'kaar acknowledgement form that I had seen her use with Varath and with her senior attendant, a brief, deliberate motion that carried, I thought, more weight than a more elaborate response would have. She was not a person who performed acknowledgement. When she gave it, it meant something. She picked up her grain tea and turned back to the stars. We stood together on the deck for another hour. I read, she didn't leave. On the evening of day 8, Varath Ansari came to my berth and told me, with a careful neutrality that I respected, that the princess had requested my presence at the arrival reception the following morning. Not as a compact requirement, the arrival reception was already on my schedule, so no request was necessary, but as a specific request. She wanted me to stand at the forward position rather than the ward officer's side position. I said, all right. He said, the forward position is where the first bonded stands in Vel'kaar arrival protocol. I said, I understand. He said, it is a significant position. I said, I understand that too. He stood for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he said, the Vel'kaar boarding team filed a transit irregularity report with the Compact Tribunal this morning. It is standard procedure when a boarding is administratively curtailed. The preliminary finding you cited will likely be elevated to a formal ruling within the next Compact session. He paused. This will close the legal gap the Vel'kaar have been using for 4 years. I said, good. He looked at me, he said, you knew that would happen. I thought it was likely, I said. When you cite a preliminary finding in a formal dispute context, it triggers a review. That seemed like the right outcome. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I have been a transit coordinator for 11 years. I have observed 22 ward officer crossings. He stopped. He began again. In 22 crossings, the ward officer has never been the one to curtail a Vel'kaar boarding through legal argument. He paused once more. You were not what I expected. I said, I rarely am in my experience. He left. I finished my reading and went asleep. The harbor came into view on the morning of day 9. I dressed in the appropriate jacket, sealed my compact documentation, and went up to the forward deck at the designated time. The Vel'kaar destination registry harbor was visible through the observation glass, a long, low arrangement of dock structures in the amber and gold colors of the upper registry, with several court officials already assembled on the formal reception platform. It was, by any measure, an arrival. Things had been prepared. People were waiting. The arrival protocol required the transit coordinator to lead the formal disembarkation, followed by the bonded pair at the forward position, followed by the attending court. I knew this. I had read the protocol on day 1 when Vareth had given me the printed schedule. I had not expected to need it in this particular way, but I had read it. I stood at the forward position on the arrival deck. Thessavel Ansari came to stand beside me. She was in the full ceremonial robe of the treaty passage arrival, dark, formal, the gold at the hem catching the harbor light in the particular way it had been designed to catch. Her hair was arranged with the silver wire braiding of the upper registry. She was, as she had been since the beginning of the crossing, composedly and entirely herself. She didn't look at me when she took her position. She looked at the harbor ahead of us. I could hear the court behind us, Thessal Anveth and the 2 younger attendants, and the remaining crew in their formal positions. The barge was making its final approach. The dock structures were resolving out of the transit haze into their specific shapes. The officials on the platform had arranged themselves in the formal reception order. She said quietly in compact standard, when the Vel'kaar first came aboard, I was on the upper deck. I was watching. She paused. I have been told what happened in the corridor. Vareth told me. Thessal told me. The crew told me. I also watched the inspection team when they left the barge. I said, I noticed them boarding later in the corridor. She said, they moved differently when they left than when they arrived. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the senior reachblade did not look at the hatch when he left. He looked at the corridor. I said, I noticed. She said, he was looking for you. I was in the lower dining section by then, I said. He knew where I was. He had the layout. She said, he was looking not to find you but because you had become something he needed to have a location for. They do that, the Vel'kaar, with things they have reclassified as significant. They track the position. She paused. He had not done that when he boarded. You were the small one then. By the time they left, you were something else." I didn't answer. She turned her head and looked at me for a moment, directly, the compound gold eyes steady. She said, "In 9 days I have watched you read on the observation deck every morning for 6 days, share grain tea in silence, cite a compact docket reference in a corridor that my best legal scholar could not find, accompany 8 Vel'kaar inspection officers through 38 minutes of inventory without raising your voice, and then go have dinner as though you had done an ordinary thing." I said it was an ordinary thing. It was the thing the day required. She said, "That is what makes it extraordinary." The harbor was close now. I could see the faces of the officials on the platform. The barge's approach was smooth and careful. All of the preparation had been correct. She said, "In Vel'kaar Treaty Passage Protocol, the first bonded speaks a recognition at the arrival point. It is a formality, usually, a compact recitation." She paused. "I have been deciding since yesterday what I want to say." I said, "You don't need to say anything beyond the compact recitation." She said, "I know." And then she said, "His name is Soren Kale. He is a ward officer of the Union Compact. He came aboard as a treaty formality and stood in a corridor for 38 minutes and changed the shape of a legal gap that has existed for 4 years without raising his voice. He found in 1 hour what the best legal scholar on my registry could not find in 6 months. He did not tell me this was remarkable. He told me it was what the day required." She was looking at the harbor as she said it, not performing it for the officials on the platform, not making it ceremonial in the hollow way, saying it the way you say something true out loud for the record, because the record should contain what actually happened. She said, "The Vel'kaar named him the Small One when they boarded. When they left, they knew where he was." She paused. The harbor was very close now. The barge's final deceleration had begun. "He is not a formality. He is the man who came aboard with a reader and a compact seal and an honest preference for silence, and when the day required something else, he was exactly what it needed. His name is Soren Kale, and he is the one I choose to name at the arrival point, not because the compact requires it, but because the record should be accurate." The barge touched the dock. I don't have a word for what she said, in the Vel'kaar sense. I am not a Vel'kaar court scholar, and I don't know what the formal categories are for that particular kind of statement delivered in that particular moment. I know what it was in the sense that I know what things are when I have been paying attention to them carefully and long enough. She had looked at what was true and said it out loud, without embellishment, in front of the officials on the platform and the court behind us and the harbor and the whole clear morning. She had not been asked to. She had decided. That is, in my experience, a different and more significant thing. The ramp came down. She said, in a quieter register, just for the deck and the morning and whatever records were kept by proximity and attention. "Thank you." I said it was the assignment. She said no, it was something else, and she walked down the ramp. I stood at the forward position for a moment after she went. The harbor smelled like the local atmosphere, mineral salt, and something warm I didn't have a name for. The officials were moving through their formal reception sequence. The court was disembarking behind me. The sun of the destination registry was at the angle that makes mornings particular and worth noticing, the light going long and specific across the dock, catching the gold inlay on the barge's hull and making it glow. I picked up my duffel, which I had carried up with me, and I walked down the ramp and onto the dock. I had a transit log to file and a departure confirmation to register and a flight back to Orcs station to book. I had my reader and my compact seal in my left knee, which was aching pleasantly in the good morning air. I had 11 crossings behind me, and however many were still in the queue ahead of me. I thought about the corridor on day 7, the Vel'kaar reach blades and the inspection team and the 38 minutes and the quiet that had come after. I thought about the observation deck and the grain tea and the woman standing at the forward rail watching the transit lane in the mornings, coming back each day to a deck she had not planned to come to, staying for a reason she had not planned to have. I thought about the docket reference in the subindex, and the legal gap that would close, and the way the senior Reachblade had looked at the corridor when he left. Things require what they require. I have spent most of my life trying to be what they require in the moment when they require it without announcing that I am doing so. It is not a heroic posture. It is, in my understanding, simply the correct one. You carry what you might need. You notice where you are. You stand where you are supposed to stand. And when the day calls for something, you have it. I walked to the transit office to file my log. The harbor was bright and specific and entirely itself. The gold inscription on the Araneth's Meridian's hull caught the morning light from across the dock. 3,000 words of navigational hymn that had been on every vessel of its class for 400 years, and I thought that was a reasonable thing to have carried through the years. A record of what the ship knew, inscribed in the place where it would always be visible, because the record should be accurate. It was, as far as I could tell, a good morning to have been in the right place.